Literary Legends and Luminaries. I'm Julie, and welcome to another episode of Booksmart. Today's episode is one that I can relate to. It's called Scratched, a memoir of perfectionism by Elizabeth Talent. I bought this book because I am a perfectionist. Perfectionism kept me from speaking up at school out of fear I would have the wrong answer. Perfectionism made me invisible since I figured if you just fade into the background, no one can criticize you. And perfectionism kept me from taking risks because, well, you can't control the outcomes of such risky adventures. I couldn't wait to read this book. And if you look here at all my little kitty cat tabbies I have, there's a ton of breathtaking bits of wisdom, brilliant literary passages, so much so I thought this book was a keeper. But the book was quite the letdown. I know. It sounds horrible. A book about perfectionism, and all I'm doing is pointing out what went wrong with it. From one perfectionist to another, I suppose such behavior is expected. Since I'm critical of myself, I might as well be critical of everything else. But let me defend myself. The back of the book is what intrigued me. I must read you what it says to sell the book. In the decade between ages 27 and 37, Elizabeth Talent publishes 5 literary books with Knopf. Her short stories appear in the New Yorker, and she secures a coveted teaching job at Stanford University. But this extraordinary start to her career is followed by 22 years of silence. She wrote, or rather published, nothing at all. Why? Scratched is the remarkable response to that question. I'm sold. This book sounded perfect to me because I'm a writer. So I'm very intrigued to find out why she stopped writing despite relative success for a decade. But you're not going to find the answer in this book. That's what was equally baffling and frustrating. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, literally, for I'm going to read you the first paragraph, or at least part of it, with how she begins her story. Notoriously, we can't finish a thing. The truest perfectionist, the one I'm failing to be, would still be rewriting this sentence. As a perfectionist, I leave a lot to be desired, and if you leave a lot to be desired, you're unlikely to run out of desire. You might even be said to have found a way to live and breathe desire, because if the price of never-ending desire is never getting up to the end of anything, perfectionism willingly pays up. Is it a raw deal? In a boon rare among afflictions, to name yourself its sufferers, to flatter your own character as uncompromising, bound to impossibly high standards. She has me hooked, for she's writing about me. I could have very well written this, but I didn't, because if I did, well, I'd use paragraphs and the occasional period to end a run-on sentence that lasts over a page. Stylistically, I struggled with Scratched. But I'll get back to that. The title Scratched is perfect. Her mother refused to hold her days after Talent was born. She was covered in scratches, which the nurse explained can happen, that the baby scratches itself with its nails while still in the womb. Yet then the book just skips ahead. Talent develops her mother somewhat, who ends up designing a house just the way she wants it. But then, well, I don't know. Talent ends up moving in with a boy, which her parents don't think is a socially acceptable thing to do, even though she's an adult. Talent was born in 1964, so times were different then. She doesn't speak to her parents for years until she's an established author. Readers will only get snapshots of Talent's childhood, and I feel like I'm missing out on something. What Talent develops and what she doesn't is highly confusing. The new home they move into is described for a few pages, but then whole events are skipped over. She then develops an incident where she gets into the wrong car thinking it's her dad, and then it goes nowhere. I have no idea why that incident was included in the book. This is where I feel like a moron, an idiot, a newbie sitting in my college English class and not understanding a word of hills are like white elephants. But my professor is going on and on about symbolism and its literary value to the canon. I feel like a pathetic nincompoop only able to understand the likes of Flowers in the Attic. I feel Talent tries too hard with her stylistic choices, like she's emulating Virginia Woolf or James Joyce with a lack of paragraphs and punctuation, vague passages that are neither chronological nor developed, stream of consciousness that leaves the reader out of the action. At one point, Talent throws in that she went to an analysis, which I suppose is a fancier word for therapist, and that this is the one she married. Well, we don't learn too much about that later in the book, although, gee, I have a ton of questions about that. Yet, Talent at times writes beautifully about perfectionism. When she focuses on perfectionism, she articulates what it is and how it functions for those who, have it or suffer from it. I'll give you an example. Perfectionism hits a perceived error hard. It's scorn auraed with eloquence, and it moves fast, faster than conscious thought, which might be why perfectionism in action feels more real than ordinary thinking. Why perfectionism has this air of lightning strike inevitability, because it's like the brainstem wordlessness of drives and reflexes, searing communicativeness suited to nanosecond life and death decisions. Like those reflexes, perfectionism feels unerring. Like you shouldn't distrust it or you'll die. The instant of consenting to perfectionism's excisions is a radiant alliance with grace. To resist perfectionism is hard for a number of reasons, but one of them is how lumbering and flat-footed conscious thought is revealed to be in any contest with instantaneous certainty. Talent also haphazardly throws in some researchable tidbits about perfectionism. I enjoyed these brief segments, but they're all just kind of thrown in wherever, which is essentially the format of the entire book. The reader will only get fragments of Talent's life as she discovers her ability to write. The boyfriend she chose over her parents moves with her to New Mexico only after they marry. They move to New Mexico for her. She gets a prestigious graduate school admission for archaeology, but then she doesn't go to class. She loses me again, for she doesn't develop in any coherent sense why she doesn't go. It appears as though she's depressed, but I have no idea. Her house is even a disaster. As a fellow perfectionist, I hate messes. Everything has to have its place, so I'm quite confused. She works at a bookstore and stays there after it closes and writes on their typewriter, but she doesn't explain why she suddenly starts writing, what drove her to do so. This is the part I really want her to develop, to explain all these writing aspects and how her perfectionism played a part. But we don't get anything at all. I actually thought my book was missing pages. Then she develops a bus ride when she has the bus driver drop her off in the middle of nowhere. She's suffering from morning sickness. Then, poof, she's a mother, an established author, and a professor. She sort of combines parenthood and writing in this passage later on in the book. And I'll see if you can somewhat make sense of it here. Perfectionism is, in a sense, the failure to be interested in things as they are, or people as they are. The mortal loneliness of perfectionism originates in its blindness to what is right before one's eyes, to sentences as they are, a newborn's gaze just as it is. The perfectionist's interest is reserved for a fixed destination, the perfect version of the page or child toward which the actual sentence or child can be forced to move. And because the preternatural attunement of a child craving love divines that destination, the parent's perfectionism can imperil the child's ownership of herself and warp her into an ally in the pursuit of the unreal. And then she goes on and on and on and on and on and on, and I don't know if there's even a period somewhere in there. So did any of it make sense? I feel like I'm still missing out, yet I don't know exactly what I'm missing out on. It's as if Talent leaves breadcrumbs for her readers, breadcrumbs that won't lead to the loaf of bread, only to more breadcrumbs, and then suddenly the trail ends and we have to find a new trail, which will also lead nowhere too. Some of it relates to perfectionism, some of it doesn't, and it doesn't seem to connect at all. If you ask me what the theme and or subject of this memoir is, I'm not sure I could tell you. Random incidents with random thoughts and maybe a little perfectionism. I wanted to love this book, but Talent's abstract writing ruined it for me, especially when at times I didn't find it authentic. You know when you're reading a book and it feels like the author is trying too hard, that it's not coming from a place of authenticity, but for a strategic reason, not like literary elements where authors use foreshadowing and whatnot. I'm talking about when memoirists deliberately choose a style or even ideas that's forced upon the reader, like when authors Melissa Broder and Lisa Taddeo overuse pornographic details, or when authors add in details about their young children refusing to eat at certain fast food places because of the restaurant's stance on political issues, or when authors try to be artsy, not because that's the best way to tell the story, but just for the sake of being artsy. That's what I feel Talent did with Scratched. It's abstract not for coherence or even to oppose what perfectionism looks like. It's to reach only an audience of snubby literary scholars, not the average reader. It's a book I imagine the likes of Sylvia Plath would have discussed with her group of writer friends. A prestigious college instructor writes a book that only James Joyce would understand if even he understood Ulysses. Writer Sigrid Nunes wrote this about Scratched, which appears on the cover. And she wrote, Reading Scratched gave me the feeling of standing very close to a blazing fire. It is that brilliant, that intense, and one of the finest explorations I know of what it means to be a woman and an artist. Whew. Well, that's a load of something. Yes, in places I can kind of see it emerging. There are exquisite passages that reveal exactly what perfectionism is and how it manipulates us. But what it means to be a woman? No, not at all. I don't see it. And an artist? Well, she didn't develop that at all. That's the biggest issue I have with the book. The memoir aspect of this being about writing fell short, if this is even a memoir at all. Because I don't have one clue why she quit writing, partly because I don't fully know why she started writing in the first place. But then maybe I'm not highfalutin, an aristocrat when it comes to highbrow literature. I'd like to think I'm intelligent, that reading about 50 to 70 books a year makes me smarter in a worldly sense and in a writerly sense. But I suppose Sylvia Plath would have never sat around discussing the merits of Little House on the Prairie or would have found any artistry in the advent of 1980s MTV music videos. Ultimately, I'd skip Scratched if I were you. The dozen or so passages that I marked with my kitty cat tabs are not worth your time to find nor your money for the whole book. It's confusing, even borderline incoherent at times, and certainly will not answer the question about why talent didn't write for 22 years. It won't give you much insight on perfectionism, and it certainly won't help you if you're self-sabotaging your own writer due to your inability to write that perfect sentence. Perhaps I'll write a book about perfectionism, one that makes sense to the average reader. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.